Okay, so Nietzsche is, as I say, the philosopher of the death of God par excellence. And he says, we moderns, even if we're secular, even if we're atheists, we don't really appreciate what it means to understand the death of God. And he kind of thematizes this most clearly in this passage, 125, the gay signs. I'm not a great reader of this passage, but I'd give it a try. Okay, and it's called The Madman. And it's kind of funny in a way, because Nietzsche himself went mad and was insane for the last 11 years of his life. But what's important here is he's having a madman announce the death of God. Okay. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, I seek God, I seek God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. Has he got lost? Queried one. Did he lose his way like a child? Questioned another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage, emigrated? Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eye. Whither is God? He cried. I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us a sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we need to light a lantern in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers or burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? Gods too decompose. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed. And who is ever born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent and looked at his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. I have come too early, he said, and then, my time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. Okay. Okay, it's extremely dramatic, but what's important is, remember, when he first announces the death of God, he says, well, where is God? They're all whooping it up and laughing at him. In other words, these are kind of like the village atheists, and they think it's a big joke. But in the end, they're kind of totally amazed by his questions. And that is, those people in the marketplace are really us. That is, he's thinking of, he knows there are plenty of people who are still religious in modern Europe, but he's thinking of certain educated secularists who take themselves to be thoroughly atheists. But he says, you really don't understand what the death of God means, and what it means to surpass the humanity that has been built on religious belief, to tie in with the title. You see, those village atheists, they're atheists just in a sense that they've given up on a certain ontology, they've given up on a certain cosmology. That is, they don't believe there's this benevolent father figure in the sky who's made us and has a plan for us. That much they've given up on. But Nietzsche thinks, look, and he says this in various places, it's foolish to think that what is fundamental to a religion, any religion, but especially the Judeo-Christian religion, is its ontology. He thinks the real core of a religion is not what it says exists, but its normative, moral, ethical commitments. And what he says is, what we moderns have done is, he said, a lot of us have scotched the belief in God, scotched the belief in that benevolent story, scotched the belief in God as a creator, but we continue with those same moral commitments. Remember, he said the light of the stars takes time to come. It has not reached men. He What it is for it to really reach us, what it is for us to thoroughly appreciate what the death of God means, is to start questioning the basic Judeo-Christian values which are still central to our culture. And two of those most important values for Nietzsche are actually the value of truth and the value of compassion. You see, there are lots of, for Nietzsche, there are various secular variants of Christianity around in the 19th century that might still be around today. For instance, well, this one is not so much around. Marxism, communism, utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill, he was an atheist, but he still believed in the summum bonum, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. He still had what Nietzsche called a morality of compassion, but he thinks that's just a secularized form of Christianity, because Christianity makes compassion a central value. So there's all these now philosophers who may be atheists, but they still continue with basically Judeo-Christian values, in particular the value of compassion and the value of truth. And so what Nietzsche says is to really interrogate and understand the death of God is to see, well, those values originally rested on God. That is, we cared about truth because truth was God's word, and in valuing God, God tells us, value my word. We care about compassion because it was one of God's commandments. But, well, if we don't have God now, on what do those values rest? That is Nietzsche's great question, and that's the question he wants us to ask. He wants us to interrogate those values. Now, I have to say, for us moderns, it's very hard to see what the question is. I mean, you can understand what I've just said, but can you really question the value of truth? Can you really question the value of compassion? Well, Nietzsche does more than just say, look, the foundation of those values have been decimated with the fall of God. He actually gives us perspective whereby we might see that there are alternatives to having those values. And I want to get around to that today. I won't have that much to talk about the value of compassion. I'll have a bit to say about it. Okay, I just want to make some very quick points. I'm going to make them mainly because one of the points I want to make ties into Freud later on. First of all, I'm going to talk about Nietzsche mainly on the value of truth, because that's one of the core values he thinks we still have overhanging from the Judeo-Christian worldview. I don't think Nietzsche had any theory of truth. You know, philosophers have theories of truth as correspondence with reality, coherence, redundancy theory of truth. But Nietzsche, there's the 20th century categories, and they're inappropriate to Nietzsche. Nietzsche doesn't have a theory of truth, but it doesn't mean he didn't think there are things that are true. Like I said, my mum in Australia doesn't have any theory of truth, but she thinks it's true that I'm in England. You don't need to have a theory of truth to think there are truths. There are certain postmodernists who think Nietzsche didn't believe there are any truths, but I asked you to read The Genealogy of Morals, and in the first essay, in the end of the first section, when he says, oh, those English psychologists, good on them for being psychologists, but they really get it wrong. At the end of it he says, but there are such truths. So I think it's fair to say that Nietzsche, while he was skeptical of certain received truths, wasn't skeptical about the notion of truth. And the other thing I want to say very, very briefly, because this is the part that slightly ties into Freud, is Nietzsche famously has a theory of perspectivism. Again, I think Anglo-American philosophers do a huge disservice to truth, to Nietzsche, to try to enlist him into their cause and say, oh, that's a theory of truth or it's a theory of epistemology. I think it's neither. Perspectivism is really Nietzsche's idea of what a good life is. And I want to mention this because it'll tie into something about Freud. That perspectivism is, and this is in section 12 of the third essay, he says there are multiple perspectives. But what reason he says it's multiple perspectives is because that's his ideal. You see, in the third essay of The Genealogy of Morals, he talked about the Christian aesthetic viewpoint. And he said, one thing about the Christian aesthetic viewpoint is it demands that there be one perspective, the Christian perspective, that should dominate all others. That the importance of truth, the importance of compassion is a value that needs to be universally held. Right? And why he introduces perspectivism just after he's mentioned this is, he's giving his counter-ideal. His counter-ideal is what is healthy is to have as many possible perspectives be expressed. So perspectivism isn't an idea about what the truth is or what knowledge is. It's really an idea of health. Because that is one of Nietzsche's fundamental values, health. And one of the reasons he so excoriates Christianity is because he thinks it's pathological. He basically thinks it's pathological because it demands that we repress a large deal of our nature, our animal nature, our sexual nature, our aggressive nature. And obviously this is a theme that was taken up very much by Freud, especially in Civilization and Discontent, which we'll be hearing about shortly. That said, I want to say, Nietzsche uses the word health, and you can say, well, okay, that's his new value, but what does he mean by health? I want to give you a very quick snapshot. It's not central to my talk, but I think it might help with Freud, especially since Freud's notion of health was somewhat similar. that they both had a notion of health as sublimation. Nietzsche's notion of sublimation is, Nietzsche thinks what we are as living beings is just a collection of drives. He says what Christianity wants is, it says only certain drives should be respected. Your drive to be sociable, which is expressed in your drive to be compassionate, but drives to be aggressive, drives to be dominant, they all have to be repressed, they have to be disowned. That makes, as I said, sick and pathological, and in a wonderful phrase he used in the preface of Genealogy of Morals, it makes us strangers to ourselves. Strangers to ourselves because we become unaware of parts of ourselves, and they become, to use Freud's wonderful word, split off. Nietzsche's notion of health is not that you express your drives willy-nilly and become aggressive and, you know, attack everyone who annoys you in any set of way. His notion of health is, and he thinks what great people have, see, he thinks people like, say, me, are just a collection of drives that go in different directions. You know, the joke I put is, part of me wants to own a 61-inch TV, part of me wants to be a good Nietzsche scholar, and what the hell have they got to do with each other? I'm just a collection of drives and there's not much order there. But he thinks there are these great individuals, and the list, Goethe's always on the list, Beethoven's always on the list, Nietzsche's always on his own list, Wagner is on the list and then he's off the list. But anyway, what is important about great individuals is they have what he calls a master drive. And the master drive is a drive that is stronger than the others and deals with the other drives not by repressing them, pushing them down so they're not expressed, but by co-opting them. And to explain sublimation, actually, and I'm going to do this because some of you have read that essay, Leonardo da Vinci, which is, I think, the reading for the Freud. It's a very, very difficult essay, and Freud famously gets it wrong. But interestingly, Leonardo is Freud's main case of sublimation, and it's a really good case for Nietzsche. Actually, I think Nietzsche spells out sublimation in a way Freud didn't. See, on a Nietzschean account of Leonardo had Freud claims that Leonardo was a repressed homosexual, and he actually claims he was asexual. All of that's probably historically completely wrong. But let's just go with Freud. But here's the Nietzschean/Freudian take on what happened with Leonardo. Leonardo has a master drive, which is towards artistic, scientific creation. And that's the drive that he expresses very much in his life, and it kind of co-opts the other drive. So consider his sexual drive. In the case of someone who's pathological, the sexual drive is just repressed, and maybe they have weird skin symptoms or fetishes or whatever. What happens with Leonardo is it's not repressed, it's just co-opted. Okay, so let's say, as Freud says, his primary drive was sexual drive was homoerotic. Now, if that drive was directly expressed, he would be basically coupling with young boys, and he famously had a lot of the young, beautiful boys around his workshops, right? Freud actually claimed he was asexual, and they said that's probably historically wrong. That is, Freud claimed he was sexually inactive. But anyhow, running a Freudian story through Nietzsche's eyes, you can say, okay, he's got this sexual drive, it's got nothing to do, in its simple form, with his artistic creative drive. But what it does is his artistic drive doesn't suppress it, it co-opts it. Because Leonardo, as most of you know, was absolutely obsessed with doing perfect representation of male bodies. Right? He never did perfect representation of female bodies. In fact, famously got their anatomy quite wrong. But you can see there, his sexual drive is being expressed, but not directly. It's being redirected toward the aim of his master drive. That is what Nietzsche means by sublimation. It's what Freud should have meant by sublimation. Freud got sublimation terribly wrong. Freud said sublimation is when you redirect a sexual urge to something that's socially acceptable. But it just doesn't work for reasons I don't have time to get into, maybe in question time. But Nietzsche has a wonderful account of sublimation. And you can see it ties on with his perspectivism. Perspectivism is the idea that the healthy life is letting as many perspectives be expressed as possible. But Nietzsche actually thinks all our perspectives are actually, every drive has a perspective. Like my thirst drive values this, not this. Whereas my intellectual drive values this, but not that. You know, all drives set up valuations. Nietzsche's idea of health is to let those drives be expressed as fully as possible, and the way we can do that effectively is by sublimation. That is, have a master drive, that's what the great individuals have, Napoleon is another one, master drive maybe to unify Europe, and all the other drives are dealt not by pushing them down, but by redirecting them towards that master drive. That's what I really think is at the heart of his perspectivism. Okay, now I want to talk about the value of truth. Nietzsche raises two questions. Why do we value truth? That is what we call a genetic or a genealogical question, or causal connection. What causes us to value truth? You know, you can not believe in truth and still say, why do we value truth? People can say, well, why did they call certain people witches? Doesn't mean you believe in witches. Though, as a matter of fact, I think Nietzsche does believe in truth. I'm just saying, there's a separate from the causal question and other questions. The other question is, why should we value truth? Okay? So why do we value truth and why should we value truth? And the answer to one might not be the answer to the other. Okay. Now, of course, the religious worldview has a very, very simple, I'm talking about the Judeo-Christian worldview, because that's what was central to the Europe that Nietzsche was writing for. The Judeo-Christian worldview, those questions actually have the same answer. Why do we value truth? We value truth because God tells us to. Why should we value truth? Because God tells us to. So there's a very glib and easy answer to both questions. And by the way, when I talk about valuing truth, we're valuing truth in an absolute sense, that truth is an end in itself. Because you can say it can have an instrumental value of truth. You can say, I care about having truth because it helps with me manipulating the world and increasing my chances of survival. But what's in particular about the Judeo-Christian world is it treats truth as an ultimate end, as a value above all values. Let's call that an ultimate value. As Nietzsche says in Genealogy of Morals, Essay 3, Section 24, truth was posited as being, as God, as highest authority. Truth was not simply permitted to be a problem. From the moment belief in God is negated, there is also a new problem, that of the value of truth. And actually, at the beginning of the essay, I was meant to quote, that the will to truth is in need of a critique. That's also from Genealogy of Morals, Essay 3, Section 24, and from Beyond Good and Evil 1. What in us really wants truth? A still more basic question. We asked about the value of this will. Suppose we want truth. Why not rather untruth? Okay. So, Nietzsche basically says, Christianity as dogma has died. I'll read you the quotation again because it's beautifully put in Genealogy of Morals, Essay 3, Section 27. Christianity as dogma has perished of its own morality. Let me explain what that means. That is, he means Christianity as a belief about what exists, a benevolent father figure. Why has it perished of its own morality? Well, because Christianity teaches us that truth is an ultimate value. Everything has to be sacrificed to truth and objectivity. And so he thinks that ushers in actually the spirit of the scientific age, and that will to truth actually pronounces on the end on God himself. It says we realize the truth and we come to see God does not exist. By the way, Nietzsche is never arguing for this position against God. He's taking himself as addressing an audience who are already atheists. Okay. Christianity's dogma has perished of its own morality. In this manner, Christianity's morality must now also perish. Now that the Christian truthfulness has drawn one conclusion after another, in the end it draws its strongest conclusion, its conclusion against itself. That is what he's saying is going to happen. He's saying, remember the madmen addressing the people in the crowd? They're laughing because they're already given up Christianity as a dogma. But they haven't given up truth as a value. And in that sense, by Nietzsche's light, they're still Christians, just secular Christians. Okay? I want to say a bit about compassion, because I think it's something Nietzsche's very clever on. But as I said, this is mainly about truth. But the reason I'm saying compassion is because compassion and truth are two of the fundamental values of the Judeo-Christian worldview. I'm not saying that's the only religious worldview that has those values. Many other religions have those values. Those are the values that were relevant to Nietzsche's Europe in the 19th century, and arguably still to our Europe. Okay, how does Nietzsche get us to disvalue compassion, or question the value of compassion? That is really, really hard for us to see. So I'm going to give you a snapshot. Okay, what Nietzsche says is you can think of happiness in two different ways. It's not quite his words, but I want to put it simply to get the snapshot going. You can think of happiness as kind of something phenomenal, phenomenological, feeling, vibrating in the stomach or some such. I mean, I tend to make fun of it because I don't really know what it is. But anyhow, there's that kind of, I'll call that happiness one. It's feeling contentment. It's feeling good about things. Okay? And a lot of us moderns, we care a hell of a lot about that. But Nietzsche says there's another kind of happiness, which has nothing to do with how you feel. It's got nothing to do with contentment. By the way, the first happiness he disparages by calling it herd happiness, happiness of the herd. The second kind of happiness is near to what Aristotle called eudaimonia. That is, it's kind of flourishing, if you like, it's realizing your talent. Nietzsche was an incredible elitist who thought most of us don't have talents worth developing, but I can't talk about that right now. So Nietzsche says genuine happiness is actually making the most of your talents. And that's not done from a personal point of view. You can be absolutely miserable and still, in Nietzsche's sense, be very, very happy. In fact, think about Nietzsche himself. This was a guy who had terrible migraines, headaches, he was lonely, he gave up his academic position very early on, around the age of 23, he was wandering from pension to pension, he had to pay to get his last 6 books printed, he didn't know if anyone was going to read him, and yet in some sense, he was an incredibly happy person. Not happiness in the sense of feeling content about his life. I don't think he was content for a moment. But he was happy in that he produced these brilliant books. He really realized his talents. Okay, so we've got these two notions of happiness. Well, now we can get an edge into why we might wonder about the value of compassion. Because he says, the reason we care so much about compassion, he says this also of his atheist predecessor, Schopenhauer. Because Schopenhauer very famously rejected theism, but still had a morality of compassion. He thought compassion was the highest moral value. And so by Nietzsche's life, he was still a Christian. Schopenhauer said the fundamental problem of humanity is an atemporal, age-old problem, the problem of suffering. And Schopenhauer has a complicated story to say about why life is irredeemably full of suffering. I don't have time to give that now. But Nietzsche says, look, if you think the fundamental problem is suffering, then naturally you care about compassion, because compassion is the means by which we can alleviate each other's suffering. But Nietzsche says that's an obsession still with happiness one, contentment. You want to eliminate suffering to make for contentment. But if you care about happiness two, realizing your potential, well, often to realize your potential involves taking on great challenges. And taking on great challenges inevitably involves a certain degree of failure and often a huge degree of suffering. So there you see, Nietzsche gives us a perspective where we might say, maybe suffering isn't such a bad thing. I'm not saying Nietzsche thinks suffering is good in itself, but he thinks a good life, a genuinely happy life, involves extraordinary commitment, extraordinary challenges, inevitable failures, and possibly great suffering. But if we're absolutely obsessed with, contentment, herd happiness, and then we valorize compassion, so Nietzsche there gives us a perspective. We might question whether the elimination of suffering is so important, and then we might question how important compassion is. But now I want to get to the main part of my topic, the value of truth. Well, not quite. I have one more sidebar. Nietzsche said, actually, what he predicts is going to happen is when we really appreciate the death of God, that is when we start to question the value of truth and the value of compassion. He says to really understand the death of God is to see that there's no basis for any of our values. And he predicts that, and he calls this the history of Europe for the next 200 years. And I think it's pretty prescient here. He said there'll be an absence of values. As Dostoevsky pointed out, God is dead, everything is committed. It's another version of it. Nietzsche and Dostoevsky both introduced this notion of nihilism. And nihilism is the absence of ultimate values. That is, values that can give meaning to all of existence. Notice, nihilism is not the absence of values. Because Nietzsche can't say that there's an absence of values. Because as long as there's life, there's values. That is, as long as I'm alive, my first drive will value this water, blah, blah, blah. So as long as there's drive, there are values. But what Nietzsche is talking about, and what is important about Christianity, or important about Marxism, or important about communism, or utilitarianism, they give ultimate values. Values that transcend all other values, like the greatest happiness of God's benevolent plan, etc. Okay, so Nietzsche is predicting that what will happen is that when we really appreciate the death of God, we will fall into nihilism. And remember in that passage of the madman, he said, what must we do to become worthy of this deed? Must we not become gods? What does he mean by that? Well, to become gods, see, God is an external figure who gives us our values. Nietzsche says most of us, when we lose that external figure, we realize, oh, there are no ultimate external basis for the values, and we fall into this nihilism. Oh, there are no ultimate values. But what certain people, certain extraordinary people, if you like, surpassed humanity, people like Nietzsche themselves are, they become gods and that they become autonomous self-legislators, to use the language he uses parodying Kant. That is, they are able to create their own values. Okay, so now I want to talk about the value of truth, because it's very hard for us. Maybe I've given you an inkling about how we might question compassion. I think what's harder for us moderns is answer, how the hell can you have a perspective that might get us not to value truth? Okay, well, first of all, there's a very easy answer. Supposing we originally valued truth because God tells us to value truth, because truth is God's word, but now we're secular. Well, why should we value truth? Okay, this is answering the should question, not the why do we, but why should we. But it can also be a question about why we do value truth. Why don't I just give an answer my colleague Richard Dawkins and say it's evolution. That is, evolution selected us to value truth. That is, if someone didn't care whether it was whether water nourished a poison or arsenic nourished a poison, they didn't care which was true, water poison, arsenic poison. Well, they'd have what the philosopher of the late 20th century, W.B. Quine, called, kind of a very right-wing thing to say, a pathetic but praiseworthy tendency of dying before reproducing their kind. In other words, the evolutionary story is, look, you value truth because evolution is selected. Those who didn't value truth, they're the ones who ate the arsenic from the nightshade berries or whatever. So truth helps us survive. But you'll notice that only gives an instrumental value to truth. It says truth is valuable because knowing the truth can help us survive. It doesn't make truth an end in itself, which is really the central point of the Judeo-Christian worldview, and very much we moderns treat truth as an end in itself. And as Nietzsche and others have pointed out, often it's valuable not to believe in truth. Just to give you a very, very quick example, the famous example is sports athletes. Top athletes nearly always overvalue their abilities. You know, it's no good for a footballer to say, oh, I'm just a mediocre player, but I'm okay in this team. They have to believe they're a great player. So it's known that athletes always overvalue their ability because it helps them perform. So you can see there that for a certain, often it's helpful to know what's poisonous and what's not, but often it's not helpful to know the truth. If you're just an average basketball player in a team, it's no good for yourself to go out there performing and say, I'm just an average player. You have to think you're a great player. It helps your performance. Another case, probably apocryphal, allegedly during the Vietnam War, there were studies made, and if you're caught behind enemy lines, you had an 80%, sorry, if you were lost behind enemy lines, you had a roughly an 80% chance of being caught. So the evidence would tell you, if you're trapped behind enemy lines, you should be thinking, on probabilities I'm going to get caught. But if you were one of these, and I can say this because I've got an American passport, an American go-getter, and you're thinking, I'm one of those special guys, I'm a do-gooder, a go-getter, I'm going to survive, your chances go up to, well, down to 65%. Still, on the evidence, you're going to be caught. But it's better for you to think, I'm not going to be caught, because you have a much less chance of being caught that way. Still above 50%. So I'm just trying to make this point, that often believing something that's false can be in your best interest. But anyhow, evolution only establishes an instrumental value for truth, not as truth as an end in itself. Okay. I'm going to skip a bit. Now actually, well, I'll say one more thing. Consider an ultra-scientific viewpoint. Actually, the viewpoint of that philosopher I mentioned before, W.B. Quine, probably the most famous American philosopher of the latter half of the 20th century. He thought science limes the full nature of reality. Science is the ultimate truth. But then consider this very claim, we should value the truth. Is that a scientific claim? Not at all. In fact, Quine himself would say that's a normative, valuative claim, and it's not true. So one thing Nietzsche points this out himself, he says, the faith in science which exists undeniably cannot owe its origins to such a calculus of utility. With that we stand on moral grounds. So he says, and he's pointing out the value of truth that is central to the scientific viewpoint is still an overhanging of Christian values. Okay. But now I want to give you a perspective whereby we might question the value of truth. And this is a very, very essential notion to Nietzsche. What Nietzsche claims, and here he owes a lot to German Romanticism, is he said what makes for a genuine culture is that they have a set of myths that gives them a sense of who they are, a set of beliefs, really what he called a mythology. So he thought myths are central to having a sense of identity. There's this big question in the 19th century, what makes for a real culture? And there they were looking to the Greeks and the Romans, but the Greeks have a genuine culture. We have what they call an ersatz or a Philistine culture. What makes for a genuine culture? They said unity, and what gives us a unity? A myth. And if you read the first essay of the Genealogy of Morals, you'll see some of that. Nietzsche said, look, the Greeks could celebrate themselves and their gods. Like if someone like Achilles worships Mars, or Ares, he's worshipping himself, because Ares is just Achilles only more so. That he's a mercurial, temperamental, brilliant warrior, etc., etc. So the Greeks, with their gods, are worshipping themselves, but also those gods gave them a sense of appropriate, like it's inappropriate for Achilles to run away. So it gave them a sense of normative rightness, and it gave them a sense of who they are, and it gave them unity to their culture. As opposed, Nietzsche says, to the Christian God. He says, we use our Christian God not to affirm ourselves, we don't project ourselves. Our God is everything we're not. He's omnipotent, he's omniscient, he's omnibenevolent. We use our God to reproach ourselves. We tell ourselves, you know, God wants us to be like this and we are nothing like this. You know, we're an affront to God because we have aggressive tendencies which God wants us not to have, etc. So we use God to repress ourselves, whereas they use their gods to celebrate themselves. Anyhow, so he thinks the Greeks had a successful mythology. But the point I want to make here, and I'll just quote a bit about Nietzsche, this is from the book, his work, The Birth of Tragedy, on the importance of mythology. Without myth, every culture loses the healthy natural power of its creativity. Only a horizon defined by myth completes and unifies a whole cultural movement. And this is from Untimely Meditation, The Use and Abuse of History, section 7. All living things require an atmosphere around them, a mysterious misty vapour. If they're deprived of this envelope, if a religion, an art, a genius is condemned to evolve as a star without an atmosphere, we should no longer be surprised if they quickly wither and grow unfruitful. It is the same with all great things, which never succeed without illusion. He quotes from the Meister Singer from Wagner, actually. Okay, so now you see an inkling of what might be a criticism of the will to truth. Because he thinks that the will to truth that is so predominant in the scientific modern worldview doesn't permit ourselves any mythology. So the will to truth kills all mythology, but mythologies are central to all great cultures. As he said, the complete annihilation of illusion is the drive of the sciences. It would be followed by quietism. And he then says, living in illusion is the goal. Okay? So Nietzsche actually now gives us a perspective why we might think the will to truth might be inimical to life. He says, life actually needs illusion. In fact, he said, the scientific worldview still has an illusion it often doesn't question, the illusion on the ultimate value of truth. It can't fund that illusion, it has no justification for that illusion, but it still travels under that illusion. But when we start to question all illusions, including the value of truth, we are left in a meaningless, discoloured world. I should add here that Nietzsche seems to be a bit of what we call a projectivist about values. I don't really think you can give him a clear meta-ethical position. Again, that's putting modern terms on him. But he seems to think we are the ones who push values into the world. As he says in Human All Too Human 1:16, because we have for millennia made moral, aesthetic, religious demands on the world, looked upon it with blind desire, passion or fear, and abandoned ourselves to the bad habits of illogical thinking, this world has gradually become so marvellously variegated, frightful, meaningful, soulful. It has acquired colour. But we have been the colourists. It is the human intellect that has made appearances appear and transported its erroneous basic conceptions into things. And from Gay Science 301, whatever had value in our world does not have value in itself, according to its nature. It is always valueless, but it has been given value at some time, and it is we who have given and bestowed it. Okay, so Nietzsche thinks we're the ones who project value. But he said, the trouble is, part of us, when we get scientific and objective and realise this, we kind of lose our ability, because it's very hard to believe in an illusion when you see it as an illusion. And this was a big problem for the German Romantics. I think you pick up people like Novalis and Hölderlin. They said, actually, to have a culture, you need to have a mythology. The Greeks were naive. They had a mythology that they literally believed. They believed in Zeus and Hera and Ares, etc. But the trouble is, we moderns, we don't permit ourselves any illusion. Our will to truth has become so pathological. So now we have to have an invented illusion, an invented mythology. But how can that really work? If you know it's a mythology, how can you really believe it? That actually was a problem that Wagner was grappling with, the ring cycle of operas. And I can tell you how that's meant to work, but not in this lecture. Okay, but good question. Okay, so I want to finish with one last point. Nietzsche's mentor was Schopenhauer. And as I mentioned before, Schopenhauer had the morality of compassion. He thought suffering was a big problem. But Nietzsche actually says no. And this is again why Nietzsche was a philosopher of modernity. Schopenhauer didn't care about history, because he said it's a trans-historical problem. It's in our nature. Schopenhauer basically says we are willing subjects. And he took this from Buddhism. Our will makes life painful, because we always will something. If you will X, it means you lack X. You feel the lack of X is a pain. You get X, and then the next will comes. So we're endlessly on this treadmill of willing. Life is irredeemably painful and irredeemably full of suffering. And that's why he was a historian. Schopenhauer didn't care about history, because this is a metaphysical problem. It's a problem of the nature of will. It's trans-historical. But Nietzsche, of course, is a philosopher of modernity, a philosopher of the death of God. Why? Because he focuses not on the problem of suffering, it's on the problem of meaninglessness. And now I'll quote from the Genealogy of Morals, section 3, essay 3, section 28. Man did not know how to justify, explain, affirm himself. He suffered from the problem of his meaning. He suffered otherwise as ill. He was for the most part a diseased animal. But the suffering was not his problem. Rather than the answer was missing to the scream of the question, to what end suffering? Man, the bravest of animals, And the one most accustomed to suffering does not negate suffering. He wants it. He even seeks it out, provided one shows him a meaning for it. It's at this end of suffering. The meaninglessness of suffering, not suffering itself, was a curse that thus far stretched over humanity. Okay? And as he said in Genealogy of Morals, Essay 2, Section 7, what really enrages people about suffering is not the suffering itself, but the meaninglessness of suffering. Okay, that's why Nietzsche is the philosopher of the death of God and the key philosopher of modernity. He realized that our modern scientific view, our incredible will to truth, and our credible will to objectivity destroys all mythology, destroys all illusion. Eventually it will eviscerate the world of values. We will have a colourless world. And then we face this deep, deep problem of meaninglessness. And that is what he predicted for Europe for the next 200 years. That will be the history of Europe of the next 200 years that I call nihilism. He was not in favour of nihilism. He was predicting it. He said it will be the absence of overriding values, including the value of truth. And I'll say a little bit more, because I've got about 5 minutes more, about surpassing humanity. When I heard this title, surpassing humanity, oh my gosh, I've got to talk about the Übermensch, the overman or the Superman. Nietzsche said very little about that, and didn't really care about that. He says very little about it. What he cared about is us having a goal beyond ourselves. But in that book where it's mentioned, it's only really mentioned in his book Zarathustra, which I advise you not to read. It's a very difficult book. It's very, very bombastic. It's bad in English, and my wife, who speaks, a native German speaker, will say it's even worse in German. Though a lot of things are, e.g. can't. And Hegel. I'll stop there. The list is long. Nietzsche actually talks about a particular figure in the preface of Zarathustra that's really interesting. He calls him the last man. And he says it so beautifully. He said, the last man asks, what is a star? And blinks. And what he means by that is, because a star is something way beyond us. It's an ambition. And the last man just doesn't care about it. And I think Nietzsche actually if he was here, I think he'd think of us as the last man. Because what Nietzsche said is, look, once we've lost God, there could be these people who actually become perfectly comfortable with the loss of God. They still have values. As I said, where there's life, where there's drive, life is nothing but drives, there are values. And you can have values beyond the water and the book in front of you. You can have values like your career and your family, but they have very small ball values. They don't have values that give meaning to all of existence, which is the kind of values that Nietzsche himself sought. Right? That is the kind of values that happen when you're a self-legislator. That is what it is for us to become gods. And actually, Nietzsche doesn't have a specific criticism of the last man. The last man isn't doing anything wrong when he says, what is a star, and blinks. He just says, all I care about is my career and my family. Nietzsche just finds him ugly and pathetic. So he created this character, the Superman. And the point about the Superman is not like he said, oh, we should get there and then what? History stopped. Nietzsche always cared more about the becoming, the process, than actually getting there, the being. He just wants us to have a goal beyond ourselves. Hence, he wants us to surpass humanity. But the way we genuinely surpass humanity is we give up, we realize, we become true understanders of the death of God. That is, we've not just given up on the ontology and the dogma of Judeo-Christian worldview, we've interrogated those values. We've interrogated the values of truth, we've interrogated the values of compassion, and we've come up with our own values. One last point. I don't want you to think that Nietzsche was against truth. In fact, he says, skip here, he still values truth. He says, this is from the Antichrist. The conditions under which anyone understands me, and necessarily understands me, he must have an inclination born of strength for questions that no one has the courage for, a new conscience for truths that have hitherto remained unheard. Nietzsche values truth, but Nietzsche values truth instrumentally. Nietzsche thinks truth is one of a number of competing values. He thinks for another value is health. He thinks if your will to truth makes you pathological in a certain sense, your will to truth has gone too far. And I'll give one example of the will to truth being pathological. Nietzsche would think someone who's a professor of philosophy probably has a pathological value of truth. Like, someone who's obsessed with getting Nietzsche right. That's not what Nietzsche cared for. Nietzsche cared for people. I'm not Nietzsche's ideal reader. I'm an okay reader. But, he said, you scholars, you're okay, but you're not ends in yourselves. The ends in themselves for Nietzsche are people like Rilke, Thomas Mann, Hermann Hesse, D.H. Lawrence, who read Nietzsche and used him to find their own voice. And he actually gives an incredible psychology of the kind of academic, scholarly side. He said, okay, He said, the religious people are scared of this world. This is his analysis, his psychological analysis. Nietzsche says, he who reads me well reads me first and foremost as a psychologist. They're scared of this world, so they look down on it. And they say, this world doesn't matter, it's not the real world, the world is the world to come. And I will be rewarded for my meekness, turning the other cheek, etc. in the world to come. The meek shall inherit the earth. So scholars, let's say they're secular and atheists, they stand above the world, and they do not say, oh, there's a world to come, but they say, oh, it is better to have the passions cool, to use his own phrase. It is better to be a monster of pure reason. It is better to be a monster of pure intellect. It is better to be nothing but pure thought. And then you can just reflect on the world and understand it. He said that's another way of showing fear of the world. Because the world is a world of change, of multiplicity, of passion. He said scholars try to move away from the world because they're threatened by it in exactly the same way religious people do. Okay, it's an interesting diagnosis. Which allows me to say the last part. Nietzsche values truth, but not as an end in itself. Not as an end where you become merely reflective and pathologically removed from the world. And he values a different kind of notion of truth. It's a notion of truth in German we say Ehrlichkeit, or possibly Redlichkeit. We might call it honesty today. And he said actually scholars are often very dishonest in his view because they pursue truth in their own little corner, but they don't pursue truth that could threaten their whole existence, that could threaten their whole lives. What Nietzsche wanted was a kind of person who pursued big truths, like this question of the value of truth or the value of compassion. And what he wanted to say about certain scholarly types is they don't have a certain kind of integrity, an integrity to ask these great questions. And in fact, he said their kind of will to truth is actually a way of mendaciousness. And here he has this point, I'll abstract from scholars. He said, there's another way we can value truth. We can value truth because we're scared of the world, and we want a world that we can understand and make calculable and predict. But he says that kind of will to truth is a form of mendacious. It's lying about the true nature of the world, that the world is unpredictable, unfathomable, full of passions, full of strange things. So he said, he actually points out that the will to truth can actually be a way of dishonesty in a certain sense, and a form of pathology. So the final story is Nietzsche in himself will value truth, but he said, look, in people like me and Goethe, our will to truth is not a way of removing ourselves from the world and standing as reflectors upon it, it's our way of engaging with the world. And he quotes Goethe somewhere, if I can find it very quickly. I hate everything which merely instructs me without increasing or immediately enlivening my activity. That's actually from Goethe that Nietzsche quotes. And so he actually points out, look, in certain people, the will to truth, is Nietzsche for the will to truth or against it? You can't answer that question. It's a question of what does the will to truth serve in this person, what does it serve in that person? He sees in a lot of us, especially in scholars, a will to truth that is just a demand for certainty. It's a fear of the uncertain. Will to truth and certainty arise, as he says, from a fear of the uncertain. Whereas his notion, he said, his will to truth is a will to truth that allows him to see the world in a certain way, to put a task, a great task before him, the task of creating one's own values, and in that sense, surpassing humanity.
Right, Ken, sit down and draw breath. And let's see who'd like to ask questions, make points. Okay, there in the top.
You've got a microphone.
Okay. I'll take it back.
I have a question just about Nietzsche and his relationship to freedom. I think initially there's an interesting contrast between Nietzsche and Mill and this idea of freedom in self-creation, and I think there's an interesting parallel there between Mill's idea that we shouldn't let the world or some portion of it choose out our path of life for us, otherwise we'd need nothing more than the ape-like faculty of imitation. And I think we get some of this also in Nietzsche, but Nietzsche has, it seems to me in some passages, an explicit denial of our free will. He says there is no agent doing, initiating these actions. I think he draws a parallel between lightning and its cause at some stage in the genealogy. And how does that kind of fit in with his idea of the eternal return? If you could maybe touch on that.
Okay. But take the gentleman next to you, and then there, and then down here. Yeah.
I just have a quick question, and that's regarding the parable of the madman. Why does he announce the death of God in the marketplace as opposed to a center of religious worship such as a church?
And there on the wall.
Thanks. I was just wondering, I mean, throughout all his writings, as far as I'm aware, Nietzsche seems really hostile towards Christians and the whole Judeo-Christian morality and everything. But I was wondering if he would relate his idea that of these kind of the underdogs creating their own sense of morality, would that just be in the Western Christian context, or does he think that it would happen throughout history and throughout cultures? So, for example, I think he mentions very sparingly other cultures like the Japanese and things, but does he think that it's just because of Christianity, or would he find this kind of the slave morality overtaking what he calls the nobility morality? Is that something that is just inevitable in all cultures, or is it just all the fault of all Christians?
Okay, where was I? Josephine, yeah, and then Toby, and then I'll bring him back in.
I had a question about when you talked about drives and the master drive, because we've obviously looked at other philosophers over the last 2 days, and two of the people that we've looked at are Rousseau and Plato. And Rousseau talks about the control of amour propre before man engages in with other man, which to me seems to be a discussion about the control of man's drives, natural drives, because they're corruptible. And Plato talks about the education of desire, which again seems to me to be a control of man's desire, an education of man's desire, because potentially that is corruptible. You've said that Nietzsche talks about a man having a master drive, which to a certain extent needs to control all other drives, because otherwise they are corruptible. So what would his take on Rousseau and Plato be? Because, you know, you're saying that man should be free to pursue those, and therefore we should question truth. And in a way, it's almost that Nietzsche's saying that man needs to work out what his own master drive is to control his own drives, whereas Rousseau and Plato seem to be saying that someone else should be educating the natural drives of man.
Okay, I'll just take one more.
I have to say, of all the things that we read, I really enjoyed the humanity of Nietzsche. That's something that really comes through in his writing. You get a real strong sense of person, and I found that very engaging. But one of the things I thought is he true to himself? And the thing I'm interested in is there seems to be a disjunction between his notion of the philosopher as value generator and his form of expression, which seems to pull away from taking seriously that task of value generation by not presenting a systematic exposition of his own values. And I just wonder, is there a moment of doubt in Nietzsche himself there?
There's a lot there. I'll say a bit about freedom and self-creation. Nietzsche famously actually denies that we have free will. He said that in Beyond Good and Evil, probably 719, I deny free will in the superlative metaphysical sense. And he followed Schopenhauer there. And you have to think about yourself what the real question is with free will. See, a lot of people think free will is the big disjunction is free will and determinism. But I actually think Nietzsche thinks determinism is really irrelevant. There are parts in his text where he sounds determinist in the early days, and there are other parts where he doesn't seem to be that tied to it. But I really think he thinks the whole free will debate is really not to do with determinism. Because we're obsessed with free will because we're thinking who deserves blame, who doesn't deserve blame. I call that deserts free will. The real free will, and you mentioned this in your question, the real free will that Nietzsche cared about was free will to do with self-creation and the free will to do with agency. I call that agency free will. And the question with agency free will isn't about who deserves to be punished or rewarded. It's what is it for an act to be genuinely mine. Right? I'm in the causal order, right? But I want to say some of these acts, like this is in the causal order and things happen to it. Well, I'm in the causal order too, it's just more complex. But in certain cases, we can say an act is genuinely mine. And most people believe in free will, think we've all got it or none of us have got it. What is really interesting about Nietzsche is Nietzsche thinks, oh, some of us have free will. What is for a free will? Think about what Hume says. Free will, an act is of your own free will when it stems from your nature. But what Hume means by nature is just your deepest dispositions and inclination. And Hume, a very famous case that Hume can't handle is the reluctant kleptomaniac. The reluctant kleptomaniac doesn't want to steal things, he thinks it's morally wrong, he gets therapy, whatever. And then he finds himself in an airport and next thing he knows, the drink is in his pocket or whatever. And we don't want to say, well, he did that out of his deepest inclination, but he didn't do it in his own free will. Well, Nietzsche wants to agree with you. An act is yours. It belongs to you. It's your agency when it comes from your nature. The difference is he's a very, very heavy gloss on what it is to have a nature. Having a nature is not having a set of dispositions. It's having a certain concerted, hierarchical, coherent set of dispositions. That's exactly what the kleptomaniac doesn't have. He's got the disposition to take things that don't belong to him. He's also got an honest disposition to completely approve of it. It goes back to what I said before about the master drive. Most of us are a collection of drives going every which way. There are certain individuals who have a drive that brings their drives into harmony and makes them coherent wholes. And yes, Nietzsche said there is no doer behind the deed. That's the passage you're alluding to, the lightning, the flash. But what Nietzsche thinks is in certain cases there is a doer in the deed. Not when a member of the herd, say someone watching a football match, who's just cheering along with the crowd. He's not expressing his own will. He doesn't have a will. It's a collective will. But there are these certain rare individuals, and their acts actually reflect who they are because they have a character. You see, Nietzsche thinks most of us humans, and just human is a mere biological term. We're all here, sitting here, we're humans. Very few of us count. He says this, and it's a very hard thing for us to accept. He says most humans do not count as persons. To have genuine free will is to have a certain kind of inner coherence under the lead of a master drive, and then your acts become genuinely yours, and that's a certain kind of self-creation. I can't give you the whole story of self-creation. Oh, marketplace versus church. He doesn't address the church because there's no point going for him to go to the church because that's a set of people who believe in God. He's not addressing people who believe God. And he says very disparaging things about, for instance, Christians. He said, let the rules of the herd rule in the herd. He said other horrible things. Like, well, Christian values are all fine for those people. So he's not going to go to the church and try to convince them because they're theists. He's addressing people who are already secular, hence the people of the marketplace. I can't read my own writing. Hostile to Christianity. It's very easy to get carried away by Nietzsche's rhetoric and to think he's hostile to Christianity. But think about when he talks about masters in the first essay. How does a master like Achilles, a noble, get his sense of who he is? Not by battling a slave or a foot soldier like Odysseus famously with Thersites. When Thersites says, what are we doing here? Who cares about Helen? Odysseus doesn't read it. To us readers, that seems pretty damn reasonable. But Odysseus' attitude is, that thing isn't working, and he starts hitting him on the head. It's like his sword isn't working. He doesn't engage in dialogue with him. It's beneath him. Well, similarly, Achilles, he gets his sense of value by battling someone who is worthy of him, namely Hector. Nietzsche battles Christianity because Christianity is worthy of it. Christianity basically made up. It's basically made Nietzsche. Nietzsche talks about the revaluation of all values. That's exactly what Christianity did. He admires Christianity and he admires Socrates because they helped create us. They gave us completely new values. But what he wants to say, and it's a remarkable thing, is that all great things bring about their end. He thinks the Christian will to truth is the thing that eventually turns against Christianity. And he actually thinks he's paying respect to Christianity, saying, I'm paying respect to it by helping to bury it. Its time has come and gone. Christianity remember he said what counts is not suffering but the meaninglessness of suffering? And he said the great thing about Christianity was for so long it was successful in giving meaning to suffering. But it's a myth whose time has come and gone. And we need new myths. So he actually very much respects Christianity. His view is not, I wish Christianity had never existed. That would be to show what he calls ressentiment towards the past. His point is Christianity is a great thing. It often gave rise to great people, great art, great thinkers, but its time has come and gone. It is no longer a spur to activity. Now we need to bury it and come up with new values. So he actually respects Christianity in a certain way, but he thinks its time, like all great things, has come and gone. As about other religions, look, he's Western-centric, he's mainly talking about what influenced Europe, but he does mention some other religions. Famously, he mentions Buddhism, mainly because Schopenhauer mentioned it, and he thinks Buddhism also, like Christianity, at least Buddhism admits in its theoretical form there is no God, but what Buddhism does is it still treats the problem of suffering as fundamental, and he sees that as another attempt to turn against life. So he admires Buddhism in some ways, but he sees other religions as having this A, evaluation of truth, and B, also being obsessed with the problem of compassion and the problem of suffering. Big question. Actually, what's the fifth question?
Is Nietzsche true to himself?
Yeah, okay. The fourth question, I'll talk more about Plato than Rousseau. Plato is one of these people who thinks we've got three different tripartite nature of the soul, but he thinks one part of the soul is made to rule the others, that is reason. And Nietzsche is someone who, following Schopenhauer, preceding Freud, thinks reason is just the tip of the iceberg. Reason is not the real engine. Schopenhauer will talk about the will. Freud actually used the word Triebe, drive, but of course it got Latinized in the Strachey's translation, so it's instinct. But Nietzsche and where Schopenhauer talked about will, Nietzsche and Freud talk about drive. And they think the drive, often unconscious drives are fundamental, and they think reason is just an instrument of the drive. Plato's this idea of reason as something autonomous and the natural ruler. Nietzsche does not think of reason as a natural ruler. He thinks reason is really only an instrument at the behest of the drives. And so when Nietzsche talks about self-creation, you have to be very careful about this. He's not thinking about someone who consciously creates. And you say, well, it's not conscious, it's not the self. Then he charges, as Freud's charge would be, why do you think the self has to be consciousness? That only shows the bias of the Cartesian, Platonic, Kantian viewpoint, that who we are in essence is our nature as reflective reasoner. No, who we are in essence is the nature of our drives. And that's why he sees us, in a sense, trying to murder ourselves by repressing our drives. It's a demand of Christianity. So he rejects Plato. He rejects Plato's contention that the natural ruler of the appetitive and the emotion, etc., is the faculty of reason. He wants order in the house, as does Plato. And remember, there's a very famous story about Socrates. Socrates meets a blind person in the marketplace. And the blind person can tell your character by feeling your face. And he feels Socrates' face, and I've forgotten the exact words, but he says basically, you're absolutely full of ugliness of vices. And Socrates says, ah, sir, you know me well. And what Socrates means by this is, yes, I've got many horrible drives, but I have managed to control them. But that is for Nietzsche a pathological model of health. That is its insistence that our genuine nature is our nature of reasoners, and health involves suppressing the appetite of the animal parts of us. That is for Nietzsche a pathological, sick way of viewing. The genuine healthy way is to let our drives be expressed, but what we need if we're lucky, and he says it's often it's just a case of being fortuitously lucky. He said, unbeknownst about himself, in Ecce Homo, unbeknownst, I did not know that there was an organising drive that was secretly diverting the other drive towards its causes. So he thinks those cases of genuine self-creation are not a matter of deliberation or reflection, they're actually a matter of fortuitous luck, or perhaps through the influence of a book like Nietzsche himself. That is part of what Nietzsche thinks is. He thinks his book can lessen the hold of certain Judeo-Christian values on certain select people and maybe empower them to find their own voice for self-creation. On humanity...
Oh, there's more, we can walk back. Yes, so one there and one at the back.
Thanks. When I was reading Genealogy of Morals, I also happened to read an article by James Hartfield about the values of individualism and community, and which are usually pitted against each other as sort of mutually exclusive left or right-wing views. And Hartfield argued this was wrong, this was a false dichotomy, and actually you need strong individuals to have a strong community. And it struck me that what Nietzsche's views about the individual fitted right into that. And I started, although he doesn't talk about the community in that way, I wondered if that was what he was really getting at. But listening to you, I'm no longer so sure, and I'm wondering if I was reading something into it that wasn't there. So my question is that idea there in Nietzsche, and if it's not, is it compatible?
Okay, good question. Back. Can I see any more?
I found the link between Freud and Nietzsche really interesting, and on that notion of drive and both, I was just wondering, how would one distinguish between the suppressed and the corrupted, and what would be the criteria for such a fine distinction? In the sense, the comparison between the two is sort of easily drawn, but then how does one distinguish between how the two function differently for the two thinkers? And secondly, given the importance of the master drive for Nietzsche, in conjunction with the presence of the mass of other drives, which, you know, I suppose is equally complicated and intricate other drives that we have, how static can the master drive be? So, i.e., what would be the permanency of any one master drive, given the complexity of the other drives which we also have?
Yeah, take that one and one there.
You mentioned the Nietzschean prophecies about the 200 years of nihilism. In practice, though, could a Nietzschean society come about now? And what would have to happen practically in our society? Because it especially seems that you mentioned the problem of the invented myth. How could we get over that? And I think this came up in the Rousseau lecture, the problem of there just being so much diversity, it would be impossible to get a single myth that everybody could assent to.
Actually, can I throw something in, then we'll wrap up. I've come back on a bunch of questions about strong individuals, strong communities, or strong individuals and weak communities, possibly. And that one, and the question I'm going to ask now, which was, you made the point that he parodies Kant with talk about an autonomous self-legislators creating their own values. Now, what is the nature of these values? So are they shareable and universalizable values that other people could take on board? Because in that sort of Kantian sense, you could be quite favourable to Nietzsche. You could say, well, we do need people to go around and create meaning in the world. But I suspect he doesn't think that they're that kind of shareable, necessarily social values, that they're your values, or my values. So I as a great individual in this case would be driven by my master drive to create values that are meaningful for me. And that would be healthy, in Nietzsche's view, if I've read you right, listened to you right. But for me, the question is that you could say, oh, that's all very well, and let's not worry about everybody else and hurt. We don't need to be compassionate. But won't I still be suffering because values are only meaningful for me? I mean, is that good? How is that good enough? Because everybody else is going to either have wrong values that they haven't challenged, or completely different ones from me. And won't that probably, will I not, if I look around honestly, still see meaninglessness in the world, and it being all right for me? Is that enough?
Okay, big question of Nietzsche's values. With the overhanging question, big question, the first one about humanities and Nietzsche's values. Actually, Nietzsche did have values, and Nietzsche's fundamental value was actually high culture. That's what he cared about the most. And it's very, very clear in his early works, The Birth of Tragedy. And the funny thing is, he might think high culture is a value, but he also seems to recognize it's kind of his own mythological value. It's his new value. But one thing that happened as Nietzsche kind of matured is he, like the Romantics, thought, oh, we need a new mythology. And maybe culture will become our new secular value. And that's fairly much what Wagner thought. And that's why he hitched his wagon to Wagner. Because Wagner was the ring cycle, was meant to give us a new mythology that could inaugurate a high culture. But in some sense, Nietzsche was extremely prescient. He saw it. By the way, Mill, and Mill tamed Tocqueville took the tyranny of the majority in Nietzsche. They all had this worry. They saw the coming democratization, the coming economic and political enfranchisement of most people in Western society, well, to some degree or another. And they saw that what could happen is we could have this tyranny of the mediocre. And they were very, very scared of that. Now, Mill remained optimistic. You don't normally get that. You get a lot of pessimism optimism in Mill's work, but in the letters to Hamilton, you see, he said, what would happen if the ordinary person's taste become enshrined? He said that would be the enshrining of the lowest common denominator. But he said, oh, there could be a few special exemplars, like myself and my friends, and we could raise up the herd, if you want to use Nietzsche's term, to higher taste. Whereas Nietzsche, in The Birth of Tragedy, he thought, oh, what I care about is a high culture. And that's why in that book he champions Wagner as a harbinger of a new high culture. And then he realizes that boat has sailed. Philistine culture is here to stay. You know, he's already seen Big Brother and all those kind of things, the Daily Mail and all that. He's already seen that. He railed against the newspapers. Philistine culture is here to stay. What he hoped to do is provoke a few individuals. And he thought Christianity is now being used in a way to promote, that is the value of caring about happiness and compassion is being used to promote Philistine values. He hoped to provoke a few individuals to rise above it. But, and interestingly, and this is where because someone asked a very complicated question about individual and community. And Nietzsche has a very, very nuanced view on this. First of all, while Nietzsche said Nietzsche is always negative about Hegel, because Hegel is someone who believes in this perfect Russian state, he believes in teleology and natural order, and he believes in an end of history. Nietzsche totally rejects that. But there are a couple of places where he says, we are all Hegelians. What does he mean by that? He says, we Germans, after all, we are all Hegelians. He means we realize the individual doesn't exist in a vacuum. An individual exists in a society, and it's a society that creates the possibilities. Now what Nietzsche, the young Nietzsche would have hoped, and did hope, that there'd be a new high culture and all boats would be raised. Then he realizes, no, what's coming is a coming democratic Philistine age, the rule of the lowest common denominator, the tyranny of the majority. He says, okay, I still care about higher culture, but what I now see is it's only certain individuals who can participate in high culture, and it's even fewer individuals who can actually develop and further and improve high culture. And he talked about the valleys and the peaks. The peaks are, the usual list, Beethoven, Goethe, himself, Wagner, on and off, etc. And there are us in the valleys, but the valleys are still needed for the peaks. And what is more, and what is maybe perhaps galling to us, is he said, culture is what is valuable, and if you like, you can see it as his personal mythology. Culture is what is valuable, and the ordinary person's life is justified because he's a necessary element for culture. I've got a friend, Andrew Huddleston, who's a young scholar at Oxford who works on this, and he argues brilliantly in his thesis. He puts it very, very boldly to make Nietzsche look really kind of awful. He said, think about the pyramids. The pyramids couldn't have been built without those slaves who had to move the blocks. Turns out it wasn't slaves, it was farmers on their summer holiday, so to speak. But anyway, let's pretend it was the slaves who were moving the blocks. Well, they weren't exactly enjoying moving those blocks, right? But nevertheless, Andrew argues from a Nietzschean point of view, moving those blocks gives their life value. Not in their own eyes. They would rather be back on their farms or back doing whatever. But nevertheless, because they participate in the creation of something of great cultural value, whether they cared about it, whether they appreciated it in any way, shape or form, that's what gives their life meaning. That's what Nietzsche's very condescending view is to ordinary people like us. He says, look, what counts are the peaks, like myself and Goethe and the people who come after me like Rilke and Thomas Mann. And he thinks he's on a conversation. He's in a kind of a one-way conversation. He's talking to Goethe, because Goethe can't hear him. And now Rilke and then Thomas Mann and others are talking to him. Because those peaks talk to each other and inspire each other. And it's they who justify our lives and give meaning to our lives, even if it's a meaning that we don't recognize or even care about. Now, and that partly answers your question about the nature of the values. He does see that these are his values. And he often says in Zarathustra, he says, here is my way, where is yours? And he realizes these are not values that are going to inspire everyone. And he does not expect them to be universally held to. But what he does hope to do is inspire other people to have those kind of values, the value of great creativity, of great culture, or at least to find their own values. So Nietzsche thinks what a great individual can do is someone who can create their own values and sustain their own personal mythology. But he doesn't think it's a totally individual mythology, because he thinks other great individuals have this same mythology of the importance of culture. I'll say one thing about someone brought up about Freud. What's the difference between sublimation and, if you're really into Freud, okay, you have to read that Leonardo da Vinci. I mean, it's a very difficult essay. But there's a wonderful thing that Freud wrote on this guy called Schreber, a psychotic judge. Also, according to the theme here, Freud, a repressed homosexual. But Schreber is a classic case of someone who's pathological. Schreber wrote this book, Denkwürdigkeiten, Reminiscences of My Mental Illnesses. It's a wonderful book. It's actually better than Freud's analysis of it. Yeah, you should really read it, Schreiber. It's a real hoot. He was this judge, and he thought at some point that he was a Senate's president, like a high court judge. And he had this idea that God was trying to turn him into a woman, because God wanted to then repopulate the earth. And it's a long story. And he was completely mad. He died in an asylum. But it's a complete hoot. He says things like, God and others are performing soul murder on me. It's beautiful phrases. It says things like, last week the State Orchestra of Bavaria materialized in my stomach, but by a miracle it was whisked away. It's completely mad. But the interesting thing is Freud gives an analysis, and he says about Schreiber. Schreiber, he said, also was a repressed homosexual. He couldn't say, and there is a thing, when Schreiber begins his reminiscences by saying, one day I woke up in the morning and said, after all, wouldn't it be nice to be a woman submitting to the act of copulation? And he senses that thought, says that's inappropriate for someone of my grandeur, etc. And then he starts having these fantasies of God trying to turn him into a woman, and he becomes a transvestite. And it's a long story, a very funny story, a very complicated story. But Freud's wonderful analysis is that Schreiber is basically a repressed homosexual. I'm coming to the answer. But the thing is, and Schreiber says this about himself. He eventually writes these reports because the head of the asylum was saying, this guy's completely nuts, he needs to stay here. But Schreiber, being a judge, argues brilliantly and writes a brief that got himself free. He later on got transported back. He wrote this brief and said, look, I actually believe this is true. God is trying to turn me into a woman, and there is these miracles, etc., and he's destroying parts of my organs, but they're being recreated by secret miracles. I know to your eyes this sounds completely insane, but you ask me any question about appropriate family life, any legal question, I will give you a completely appropriate answer by your life. I have this other area of my religious beliefs which strike you as crazy, and it has nothing to do with my genuine other behaviour. That is splitting off. And that is what Freud thinks of as pathology, and as does Nietzsche. Splitting off is when you have an area, like your drives, or an area of behaviour that isn't integrated. Sublimation is when you're integrated into a whole and everything fits in. So the difference between sublimation and repression is like when you have these homosexual urges and you repress them, and it maybe comes out in skin rashes or fetishes like transvestitism, etc. Sublimation, and you still have parts of you that you can see as kind of foreign, hence strangers to ourselves, to use Nietzsche's enigmatic, beautiful phrase. But the genuine individual is someone who's sublimated, is someone who's made all of them part of themselves and integrated their drives. But does that mean, and someone said, well, the same person asked that question, does that mean there's a master drive and he's master for life? Well, Nietzsche was never one who liked stasis. He didn't like becoming. He always thought being. He always said becoming. He thinks the drives are always in a gonal struggle. That's what makes them sharp. Just like Achilles needs a Hector to battle against, or he needs a Socrates or a Plato to battle against, or a Kant. Our drives are always battling each other, even in the unified individual. So it's not static. Every drive, he says, wants to be master of all the others. It's just in some individuals there's a master drive that's strong enough to deal with the other drives, not by pushing them down, but by letting them be expressed, but expressed in a way that's consistent with its activity. But at some point, for instance, if that drive is too successful, he might weaken. And then another drive might then be strong enough to master him and become the new master drive. So no, it's a great point. Nietzsche is not a philosopher of stasis. He doesn't want an end result of this is the unified individual and it has to stay like this. He wants continual agonal struggle because that's what keeps our drives sharp.
Well, with that pretty picture, I did have a hand, Dennis, there. Okay, and then there's one down here at the front on the right.
Just reading The Birth of Tragedy and the contempt that Nietzsche has for Socrates, and some things you said, I actually quite like Socrates. I quite like Socrates and the arid intellectualism that Nietzsche describes. And perhaps there is a defence of the idea that we love truth, in that it's an ineluctable factor of human thinking. You can't think anything without thinking it's true, without thinking it's false. And that's why we value truth in that sort of abstract way. But in defence also of the herd, or of us, it's because we can think, and we can think logically, that we value thinking. And it seems to me that Nietzsche's got a slightly Heraclitan sort of take on a lot of these things. So it's not that original in that sense. He does favour that sort of conflict and strife and balances, but an eternal flux. But isn't he doing down, what I'm going to call the ineluctable fact of truth in human thinking, truth and logic?
And pass it back, Craig, to the corner, and then we'll come back to
an impossible question, I suspect. But I also enjoyed reading various bits of Nietzsche. But I'm wondering, some of the things that I read I thought were particularly useful, other things I thought were strange and not particularly useful at times. I'm wondering if this is possible to answer, what you think is useful of Nietzsche to help understand the human condition.
You've got a few moments to think about that while I take some more questions, Ken, so don't worry. Just there.
You know, you mentioned it briefly there in one of the responses, the whole idea of ressentiment, because that was one of the things that, I mean, it's tempting to kind of evolve kind of a contemporary response to that, and would it be possible to talk a bit more about it, because, you know, it's used by people like Harold Bloom as kind of, I don't know whether that's coarsened it or whether or not it needs rescuing from those kind of concepts, or, in short, I didn't fully, I don't think, appreciate its use in genealogy morals, so.
Resentiment.
Yeah, resentiment, yeah. So if we could, yeah, talk about that maybe.
Okay. Are there any more? Okay, well, so, Ken, if you sort of wrap up now from the peak down to the valley.
Okay. So Socrates, Nietzsche actually says no one is closer to me than Socrates. He admired Socrates because, as I say, Socrates helped create us. He was a revaluer. But he did think Socrates overvalued reason because he thinks reason has become a means mainly of repression for us. But on the truth, I'm not one of those who says Nietzsche doesn't believe in truth. And, you know, I tried to say that in the beginning. And I think this whole, I agree with you. To deny truth is incoherent. It leads to a very facile and easy refutation. Is it true that there's no truth? It's just a non-starter to say there's no such thing as truth. And Nietzsche himself does value truth. What he's talking about is the idea that truth is a value that has to trump every other value. So Nietzsche can admire truth and think he's getting at truth, important psychological truth, but he thinks his will to truth, like all wills, have to be kept in control, have to be kept in balance. So what he's talking about is a certain kind of, what he sees as a pathology of an extreme overvaluation of truth. Truth is still a value for Nietzsche, but it's not an ultimate value that trumps all other values. For instance, the value of finding meaning in the world, which he thinks is a fundamental human drive, often has to be fed at the expense of the will to truth. Like, I kind of forgot here something about happiness, but I'm not sure.
But the second question was, what can we find in Nietzsche that's useful?
No, but I will answer that. I find Nietzsche really, really challenging on this question of happiness. You know, especially when I'm lecturing very young people, 18-year-olds or whatever. I tell them, you've really got to think carefully about what happiness is. Because we really do think of happiness as something phenomenological, what it's like to be me, how I'm feeling, contentment. And Nietzsche puts a very challenging notion about what happiness is and what's valuable. Right? For instance, like, let's talk about universities. From a Nietzschean point of spirit, I see universities as possibly places of excellence. But I find in Britain, they've endlessly talked about places of mobility. I've got nothing about social mobility. But that's one end about competing ends. But Nietzsche cares about, for instance, high culture, excellence. And, you know, that seems to be less and less on the agenda in universities. So one thing I'll say, Nietzsche really provokes us by getting to think about what we really want in life. What is a good life? Is a good life feeling good? Is it being content? Or is it possibly being miserable, struggling to do something, but doing something that you can say is in some sense ultimately valuable? And I actually find myself, if you gave me, the famous case, would I be hooked up to the happiness machine? Well, that has what I call happiness 1, but none of happiness 2, because you're not achieving anything. And frankly, personally, I'd rather be miserable, and my wife can testify I'm pretty damn miserable. But I'd like to have the other happiness. My problem is I'm obviously just not as creative as this guy, because this guy's an utter genius. I'm okay, but, that's a big hurt to me that I'm not as creative as him. But I care a lot about being creative. About ressentiment, Nietzsche himself was a person who obviously suffered a lot of ressentiment, but he tried to get over it. By the way, that is the real meaning of that really crummy doctrine of his, the eternal recurrence. Could you wish that everything would be repeated over and over again? He's just trying to give up. He said, we are so full of ressentiment towards the past. right? He said, if you could accept everything that you want your life and the whole history of the universe over and over again, that would be an example of someone free of resentment. And Nietzsche, his whole life, he tried to overcome resentment. He talked about the resentment of the slaves, resentment of their weak position. Nietzsche himself seems to have a resentment to Socrates, seems to have a resentment to Plato. But the story Nietzsche would have liked to tell, and he says, he actually admits it, he often says he's a life affirmer par excellence, but in an honest moment, he says, in the end, after all, I would like to be a life affirmer. So the end story he should tell, and wants to tell is, oh, I celebrate Socrates, I celebrate Christianity. They are what, and remember, in the first essay of the genealogy, he says, without the slaves of the revolt, history would be altogether too stupid a thing. It's a slave revolt that gave man depth. What do you mean by that? It's the slave revolt, it's Christianity, it's Socrates that made us complicated, made us modern who we are today. But his question is, what are they doing for us now? So Nietzsche's attitude is not that he wants to wipe away the past, he wants to respect the past, but open up pathways to the future. So he can see himself and see himself, oh, I don't have resentment to the past, but the past has lived its life, its influence is no longer beneficial, and at least in certain respects, we now need to move beyond it and create our own values for the future. And I find that a very interesting challenge.
Thank you very much, Ken.